Enterprises, complicated customers, right? So what do you think is the most important feature for enterprises? I actually have a hands-on experience with one enterprise client from the past quarter. But so that you don't have to guess, I have 4 options for you. Is it a performance, multilingual capabilities, security, or simple content storage? What do you think is the most important feature for an enterprise?
Security. Second one. Most painful.
Okay. I got you all. They want it all. Give me, and they want more. Not just these 4. Yeah, my name is Ondrej, and today I want to tell you something about multilingual capabilities in both Content and Gatsby. And why multilingual capabilities? Because if you do a website on Gatsby, you get performance and security out of the box, if you do it properly, of course. And simple content storage depends on which CMS you choose. So I tried to be a bit agnostic, not to do the whole presentation about content. But yeah, it depends on the choice of a CMS. 100 users have 1,000 preferences, so you know it. I want to show you how to handle multilingual content in Gatsby, and I'll show you how that is stored in content or in a headless CMS. Another part of the presentation will be about how you consume it in Gatsby, and how you can work with multilingual content and what kind of components you need to add to a site to show different languages. Now, before I start talking about language, you know that there are ISO language codes, right? Those are the ones that the browsers use. But that's the first difference, actually, between the language code and the code name on the side of the CMS, because the content that is stored in the CMS does not always need to be stored under a language or ISO language code. Why is it that way? The reason is quite simple, because the customer may have different needs. One example for all, actually, I stumbled upon that one like 3 days ago. In Brno, where Kendico has its headquarters and where I actually live, we have a zoo, or however you call it. It's a lot of animals there, you know, the place, right? And it's not a particularly good one. It's a mediocre in size. It doesn't have any special animals. So the management there tries whatever they can to get more attention from people, to get more conversions, to actually get more money, so they can finance the zoo. And what they did, actually, I think this year at the end of summer, is that they, when there is an animal in a cage, there's always like a little sign that tells you what the animal is, where it lives, and so on. And they actually did a translation of that into a local dialect in Brno. And the local dialect is so funny, if you know it, obviously. It's so funny that they got a really positive reaction on that. And you see that there is no ISO language code for dialects, right? But if they wanted to do the same on the website, they would have to store that language version under something. So that's why in the headless CMS usually work with code names rather than ISO codes. Of course, they can be the same, which is sometimes the case. Another thing that's important are fallbacks. When I, as a customer, come to you and say, "Hey Matt, I want to have a Czech version of my website, which is currently in English," Matt says, "All right, no problem. We'll just add another language, and that's done. We adjust the site, and we're fine." That's okay, but then after some time, I figure out that the maintenance of the site is more complicated than I thought it would be at first. So at that point, I need, if there is no content in Czech language, I want to fall back to English, so that the content is there if someone wants to see it, but it's not in the language. At that point, Matt says, "All right, we can handle that. That's okay." But he's got his worries now. And in a half a year, I come back to him saying that, "Hey, the website is so good. I want to add another language. I want to add Slovak language." And Matt says, "All right, let's make that fallback into English as well." And I say, "No. If there is no content in Slovak, I want that to fall back into Czech. And if there is no language content in Czech, I want that to fall back to English." And imagine if you do this for enterprise, and they have 40 languages, and every single language fallbacks into a different one. I think France and Switzerland are the best countries for that. If you want to experience that, get a customer from there. So that's another important thing to think about. Oops. I have too many notes here. And the last thing that's actually important to consider before you start working on this are the various cases for language fallbacks and actually their constraints on the side of the headless CMS. So when you got content editors working on content in a headless CMS, they are usually constrained with things like this field is required. There is a linked items field that you have to put something into. Good example would be a blog post. If you write a blog post cannot exist without an author, right? There always has to be at least one. There could be some rich text field, and the rich text field can contain references to other articles. And now we need to figure out what's going to happen if the article is translated, but the linked item isn't. Does that actually match the validation rules, or doesn't it? If there is any content in the rich text field that actually references item from a totally different language, is that okay, or would you notify the visitor that the content is in another language? So there's a lot of questions around that. And suddenly it doesn't feel like multilingual content is that easy thing to have on a website. And while discovering this, actually all these things, I found a few bugs in the system as well. So obviously I'm the first one that actually really wanted to do that. But we're developers, right? These all things are kind of business related and more of a requirement from our customer. So let's see what we need to face. First thing we need to face is the way how we get data. Depending on the CMS that you choose, you consume the data via REST, via GraphQL, or via its own SDK. Of course, when we're talking about Gatsby, it's always going to be source plugin. Yeah? So we're always going to work with GraphQL. But the model of the data coming from the headless CMS will always be different. So that's one thing to think about, to see how the content is actually delivered into Gatsby. And apart from getting the data and displaying that on the site and filtering the data on the site, there's also another thing that we need to identify the right language of the user that's coming in. Now usually we don't get the real geographical location of the user, because nobody actually gives you that nowadays. So you need to work with the browser locale. And some of the plugins for Gatsby, I have one actually on the next slide. Some of them do it by default, so they give you the functionality automatically. Some of them don't. So that's yet another thing that we have to solve as developers, to direct the user to the right language version of the page. And last but not least is the language selector that we need to add. And that's actually one thing that bothers me on a lot of sites, that when you're Googling for something, I usually Google for some stuff in English, because in Czech that's not that many content online for a small country. So I usually Google in English, and Google takes me to a site, but not to a homepage of the site, right? I'm going to an article that's deep down. And when I see that there is a language selector and I switch the language, it takes me back to the homepage. So that's another thing that's visible on a lot of sites, that they don't actually keep the context when you change languages. So that's another thing towards a great user experience. And what I actually want to show you today in terms of the real code and a real project is this project that I used for this year's conferences. But it's actually an internet portal, very simple one that shows employees of a company. It shows a list of them, and every employee can actually have it on their own page where they can change the content, they can add some stuff in there, whatever. So this is how it looks like. Not that you would need to know that, because we're going to spend the rest of this presentation in code. From now on, I'll be talking about Gatsby with content coming from Cantico Content, because at this point I need to make it a bit more specific. But the principles can be kind of applied to any other CMS, whatever you choose. And there are two things. But before we get to those, let me actually switch to GraphQL. Do you guys know that? Do you know what that is? Oh. That was a tricky question. Okay. So do you guys know this thing?
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Alright. Cool. If you don't know, this actually shows you all the content that you have available in Gatsby, in GraphQL. And this is actually where I can write my query. This is going to be challenging for me, but what I wanted to show you here is how we actually at Content define the language versions of content items. And in order to show you that, I mentioned that we have employees right in the internet portal. So it's easy for me to show all the employees. It's going to be all content item person. And I don't need to do these things. The only thing I want to display is a name of the employee. Let's see what we got. Okay. That's not the right name. That's a bio. I'm looking for this thing. And value. Okay, that looks better. It's just the first name, so let's put their name as well. Okay. Now you see, I have 3 employees in content, but I have all the items here 6 times, or even more. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 times actually. Nice. The reason for that is that I have multiple language versions of these content items, right? So that's why they are repeated. And that takes me to 2 fields that I wanted to show you. And that's, where do I have my system field? System here. System language and preferred language. So let's run that. And as I mentioned before, not every item has to be translated in order to be displayed on the website. But you still need to have a way of knowing that this is all the content that could be translated, but sometimes it isn't with fallbacks. So we actually solved that problem with 2 fields, preferred language and system language item. And how it works is that the preferred language actually tells you that this item is intended for that language. So if I query for all the content in Czech language, I'm basically basing my filter on the preferred language field, and the system language tells me in which language the item actually is. So you see here, this is translated version, the one with the CZ here, and the system language is Czech because it's translated, and the preferred language is Czech because I was looking for Czech versions of that content. But one item below, this one is in English, so the language code name is default, but I was looking for Czech language, which means that this item is not translated. Yeah, so this is the way how the source plugin works with languages. And I'm going to show that in code in a second.
And if there are multiple languages in the chain, what would be the system language? So, for example, if you fall back.
So yeah, that's a good question. Let me actually show you that, but I'm not sure if I'm logged into. Where's my mouse? Oh, here it is. Okay, let's use this one. Oh, I don't have internet. Damn. Okay. Never mind. I have to do it without it. So the way how it works is that the languages that you define in content, you define for every language you define a fallback language. So content automatically goes through all the fallbacks back to the default language and gives you the first item that's available. Yeah. Yeah, makes sense. So yeah, if there were 3 languages and the last one was actually the item was actually translated in that one, the system.language always gives you the actual language. So if you don't want to do any fallbacks, you can just compare these two fields, and if those are different, just don't display the item.
Sorry, how do you distinguish between languages and locales if you have the same language but in a different locale?
Basically, every language and locale combination gets a different code name.
Okay, so
Yeah, so in that case, you see here I have a preferred language CS, but the correct version would be CS underscore CZ, for example.
yeah, that's what I was.
Yeah. So that way.
Yeah, these can be customized, not
Yeah.
tied to
Yeah, so it's not really.
Exactly.
Mhm.
Yeah. Cool. So I think that we can go into the code now a bit. So the GraphQL query, actually how it works is that the content plugin creates all the content as GraphQL nodes in Gatsby. For every language version there is one item, so you just need to use filters for preferred language and you get all the items. And then you can adjust all the templates the way you need. And that sorts out dynamic pages, because if you have a template in Gatsby node, you define the rules under which the dynamic pages are created. Yeah, like for every employee, there's going to be one page for English, one page for Czech. So that solves dynamic pages, but there are still static pages, like the employees list, there is an index page, there could be contact page, things like that. And for that, I'm actually using a Gatsby plugin L18N, which solves this problem in a way that for every language version you create one file. And if the file is called index.en.js, this plugin actually takes the file and generates a page that is on path en / the name of the page. And it does all that automatically, so you don't have to worry about it. What it can also do is it can check the browser locale and direct the user to the right version of the page, of the right language version of the page. And it can also handle default prefixes and things like that. So it's got a lot of features. You can configure it any way you want. I'll show you that in a moment in the code. And the next thing that's left for us to do is actually to adjust the components. So when you add the plugin there, when you add the multiple languages, you still need to change your components that display the data. You need to tell the components what kind of language they should display, so they can adjust their own GraphQL queries to display only that content. So that's one thing. And the last thing that is there is language selector. That's another component that you have to implement and insert in the site. But let's take a look at how the code looks like. And I was actually, one of my presentations I did in the past, I was showing the code in a notepad, and I got a very negative feedback on that. So I assume it's not modern anymore. So I'm just using Visual Studio Code. I hope that's fine for everyone.
That's much better.
Yeah. So first I was talking about the templates, right? So let's take a look at, or let's take a look first at the configuration. I think that's best. So in the configuration, I just defined that I want the plugin, Gatsby plugin i18n, and here are some basic configuration, like what's the default language code, if there is any language code, if there is a null coming from the browser locale, and if I want to actually prefix all the pages. So even for the default language code, if I want to still do the en / the name of the page, I would just put here true. I set that to false. I don't have any reason for it, just it was easier. So sometimes it might be better to have that as en. So these are the configurations. And in the template, what I actually do, or what I actually did, is I based the GraphQL query that's actually providing the data for the template. I added here a parameter for language. So I always get either default, string literal. Yeah, I get either default or get en as the language code. And whatever I get here, I just put here as a filter. So you see I'm filtering the items. I'm looking for a preferred language to the language code. This actually ensures that I only get the items that are translated or the first fallback that exists. And that's all here in this file. I didn't have to do any other changes. Oof. I think. Yeah, that was all. What I had to also change was when I'm generating the dynamic pages, that happens here. There's a create page. So whenever that happens, I obviously needed to provide the language of that of that specific page. So I'm generating for every employee one page in each language. So first of all, I adjusted the query. So you see that this query gets all the people, all content item persons, so all employees that I have in content, and gets the URL slot. And I actually filter it based on list important, but that's not important right now. But apart from value, I also get the preferred language. So I always get which language the item is in. And based on that, here I'm adjusting the URL of the person. Yeah, so this code actually creates a page, and I need to provide a path on which it creates the page. So it takes the template, takes the data, and creates a page on a specific path. And here I'm saying that for every language, there should be a language prefix before the page is created. Yeah, so this is gonna create the check pages in CZ or CS/employees. But for the default language, it's gonna omit that language code. Yeah, so this is gonna create the dynamic pages. In terms of the static pages that I mentioned earlier, you see that here I have index.cs. I have here index.en, so I have for every language version one file, and the plugin will handle it automatically. And you see that in terms of components, there are multiple options that what you can do. One of them is you can actually wrap all your components in a wrapper element or wrapper component that is actually that actually knows which language you're using at the point of display. I did not take that route. I just propagate the language using the simple properties. So in this file, I just hard-coded CS as the language for all the components that actually need it. And in my terms, it was the layout and index content as well. So this file exists in both language versions. And the last thing I needed to change was a navigator. So navigator is this thing on the left, because it also needs to reflect in which language I currently am. Otherwise, it would be just switching between the Czech version and English version, because all the links would be for the default version. So I needed to change the navigator. I needed to tell him what kind of language it should use. We are in there right now, and I'm looking for this thing. So this is one of the links that I'm using in the navigator, and you see that there is a simple if, that if the language is default, there is not going to be any prefix, but if the language is not default, the prefix is right here. Yeah, so all the links that will be generated with the appropriate prefix. And the last thing that I wanted to show you is the language selector. So the language selector, I'm not a pro in React, yeah. So so bear with me with this. So this is really simple language selector that only takes the language as a property, and in case that is the language is default, it shows the link for the Czech language. And if the Czech language is active, it shows link for an English. And it takes the current path name into account, so it just adds the CS language code before the URL. And if the language code is already there, it just removes it. So as simple as that. And the result you can see here when I go to dashboard. Actually, my browser is using English local, so you see that there is a link for the Czech language. I still don't know why it's in that awful font, but it works. That's important. So you see that on the main page, I see the list of employees. If I go in, this is in English, but I think only these notes are translated. So these notes are in English. And if I click here to switch to a Czech, you see that these notes are now in Czech language. So much easier to understand, right? For you. So you see that it actually keeps the content, keeps the context of the language. If I go back to homepage, you see there is a CZ. So we get the right content, I can switch back to English. It's going to stay on the page. And that's all there is.